Last week, some landmark decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court dealing with affirmative action and even student loan debt, and a lot of reaction pouring out to all of that. Good morning, Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News and Talk. Would love to hear your thoughts on these rulings at 217-629-7970. You can also email me, bishoponair@gmail.com, or find me on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Just search Bishop on Air. So last week, you had the rulings out of the U.S. Supreme Court that dealt with, for instance, college admissions and whether race can be a factor in college admissions, and the U.S. Supreme Court majority opinion essentially saying no, you can't use race as a factor in college admissions, essentially overturning affirmative action when it comes to colleges. And how that's going to impact Illinois, you've got the Illinois Board of Higher Education saying that they disagreed with the ruling, that it's detrimental to black people in particular, and even Governor J.B. Pritzker releasing statements saying that people of all colors are allowed in Illinois colleges. And I don't think that was ever the question here. The question was really about whether or not you can say somebody's race elevates them ahead of somebody else. And this was a case that was brought by Asian Americans who wanted to get into universities that felt that they were being disproportionately impacted by their race in elevating others above them. So interesting to hear how some say that this is, white supremacy in these rulings, but really all it's doing is it's saying you can't use race in determining a college admission. But that was, the release on Thursday. Friday, they released several cases, landmark cases, one dealing with whether or not a website designer is going to be forced to deal with and post a website for same-sex weddings. And the case came out of Colorado, where the company 303 they ultimately were told by Colorado that they have to do this or face penalties. They brought this case, it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the creator of these websites ultimately was relieved of any liability for not having to say something. So you had a question of, can a government force a creative person to create something that goes against their freedom of speech? They didn't want to do this, and that's something that we've heard even when it comes to wedding cake designers and how this is going to impact that industry when it comes to website designers, florists, other creative types, even wedding cakes. You can't force somebody to say something on a wedding cake or on a website, and I think that's the crux of this. It's being listed as those who oppose the ruling saying that it's anti-LGBTQ+. But it really comes down to the question of, can government force you to say something that you don't agree with? And I think you can extrapolate this even further, this ruling, to ultimately have it where you can't be forced to use pronouns. Now, I didn't explicitly go into that, but I think that this opens the door for similar types of challenges. If somebody's being forced in their work environment or at a government agency to put into their email signature their pronouns, and people just don't want to have to be forced to do that. So it'll be interesting to see if this impacts that. But you have a whole host of people from Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker to the Chicago mayor and state legislators releasing statements, even the governor saying that the case is discrimination and it allows it to pervade under the guise of free speech, he says. LGBTQ Americans deserve the same protections and rights as everyone else. Pritzker said in a news release, "Make no mistake, in Illinois, I promise that we will continue to fight to ensure that you are respected and safe, no matter who you love." So you had others like State Representative Kelly Cassidy saying that the ruling was, quote, very chilling. You had others, including the Cook County Board President, releasing a statement saying this will not affect Cook County's commitment to ensuring that our residents are protected under our local laws. But the Thomas More Society, Chicago-based national nonprofit law firm, they praised the Supreme Court's decision and wrote in a news release that the ruling reinforces past court wins guidelines by their group to protect people's religious beliefs. So I'd love to hear from you at 217-629-7970. This particular case and how it is being interpreted. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
Greg, I got one issue with this, and it's with the pronouns, the they.
Whoa! You're going to have to, I don't know what happened there, but a little bit of feedback. And yeah, all right, you're going to have to call back. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happened there. Got into a loop and started feeding back. So maybe if I do a few little switches and clips here. Okay, let's try this again. All right, you're on WMAY. Is it you again? Let's see if this works.
Yeah, Greg, the pronoun warriors came after me. Holy hell!
Apparently.
Hey, it's when they use they to describe one person. It drives me insane. They implies more than one. So I'm waiting on a cop trying to take a statement going, they, oh, there was more than one? Well, no, they walked over there, and then they broke into the, wait, who? We're chasing our tail with this.
Yeah, I mean, the pronoun conversation is just, one facet of this, right? Are you going to be forced to say somebody's pronouns? And we've seen it come up in schools where a student doesn't want to say somebody's preferred pronouns, and then they get kicked out of school. So that's not this case, though, right? This case was about a business owner who did not want to be forced to write something on a website that they didn't agree with. And it's not a private entity. It is a private entity. It's not a public entity. So that individual has free speech rights, and they can't be forced by a government to say these things. So that's just one particular case. But you had another case also that's making a lot of headlines, and it deals with student loan forgiveness. We'll touch on that coming up. But on the issue of, whether or not you do business with a private company, that's entirely up to you. In this country, we have that voluntary exchange of goods for services and exchange of goods and services for money. And going into a place of a public accommodation, I think this is also crucial with this case about the website designer. It's a narrow case, right? People may ask, well, what does this mean for a gay couple wanting to go buy meat at a butcher? This didn't deal with that. Right? This was specifically about a creative individual who has a private business not being forced by a government agency to say something they don't agree with. This didn't have anything to do with public accommodations of somebody going into, a store to buy something and being blocked because of their race or because of their sexuality. This has nothing to do with that. This has to do with whether a government can force a business owner to say something that they don't agree with. And I think you get that a little muddled whenever the emotions start coming into this, right? And you see that a lot with some of these statements that are being released. It doesn't have to do with places of public accommodation. It has to do with whether or not government can force somebody to say something. So that's really the crux of this particular case. But look at, for instance, the whole Bud Light situation, where Bud Light sponsored a transgender individual, and you had the whole blowback of people who boycotted Bud Light. Well, that's the free market at work there, right? Nobody forced Bud Light to say those things. They did it on their own. They sponsored a transgender individual on their own, and the marketplace reacted, and Bud Light's sales have plummeted like 28% or something to that effect. There's even calls, a former Anheuser-Busch executive saying that the current CEO should step down because they've been paralyzed by this boycott. So listen, if you don't like how somebody does business, you don't have to do business with them. If you don't like that a website designer is a Christian and has certain values, then why would you want to do business with that person if you think they're a bigot? So interesting to see this case, similar to the gay cakes case that came out a few years ago. But I don't think it's going to be the last time we hear about this particular issue. So I'd love to hear your thoughts at 217-629-7970. That's the phone number. Coming back, we will talk about the student loan order that was issued, the student loan debt forgiveness that President Biden was trying to unilaterally impose. Well, the Supreme Court struck that down. So we'll touch on that next year on WMAY. Take this call before the break. Good morning. You're on WMAY. What's up?
Hey, good morning. I wanted to talk about the Supreme Court case with the guy that didn't want to do the website.
It was a woman who didn't want to do the website, but go ahead. Yeah, you're on the air.
Okay, yeah. Well, suppose it was, I don't want to do a website for a Jewish synagogue because I don't like Jewish people. Is that still considered the free expression of their speech?
If the government comes in and says that they're forced to do that, I think that's, again, where the crux of this case came down. Do I agree with somebody denying another individual business? I don't think it's a good business move, in my opinion, but I don't think that the Supreme Court is siding with governments being able to tell people to do something. Does that make sense?
It does, and you're right. It's bad business. It's like, everybody's dollars are created equal,
right.
But
mostly. All right. I mean, the dollar's plummeting in value, and then we hear the concerns about that, and compared to other currencies. Anyways, that's another conversation for another day. But in principle, I agree. It's bad business for somebody to not want to do business, right?
Absolutely. Pull their business license, not let them do any kind of business.
Well, I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can, it comes down to, can the government force somebody to say something they don't agree with? That's really what this comes down to. It has nothing to do with the sexual proclivity of somebody or the race or religion of somebody else or a customer base. It really comes down to the crux of, can the government, in this case Colorado, tell this business owner what they need to say or face penalties? And the Supreme Court said you can't do that.
Okay.
Appreciate the call. It is Springfield's Morning News on WMAY. More to come. So it wasn't just the ruling on the website designer not being forced by a government to say something they don't agree with. You also had the Supreme Court Friday slap down the Biden administration's plan for student loan, quote, forgiveness, which really just was going to be a bailout for $400+ billion of student loans. Now, student loans have really been on hiatus since the start of COVID, and they're set to start being paid back in October. And there's some concerns about the economic impact that's going to have, because right now, the $200, $300, maybe in some cases $400+ a month that people have to pay for their student loans, that's no longer going to go into the economy. Instead, it's going to go into student loans. So there's concern there that kind of financial hit to the economy could have some negative economic consequences. So we'll see how that plays out. But when it comes to President Joe Biden's efforts to give $10,000 of loan forgiveness, which is really just transferring the obligation from the individual to the taxpayer, that was slapped down by the U.S. Supreme Court. And interesting to see the social media reaction. A lot of people saying, oh, well, look, all these businesses got PPP loans forgiven. And that was the Paycheck Protection Program. If you remember, governments across the country shut down businesses. So in order to not have devastating economic impacts during COVID, when governments shut down businesses, Congress passed a law. This is the important part. Congress passed a law that said we're going to give out trillions and trillions of dollars to local governments, to state governments, to universities, to schools, to private businesses that are impacted by the government shutdowns. And if the private businesses can show that they're using this for payroll to keep people employed, then those can be forgiven. All right, so that's the key difference here. Yes, there was a lot of fraud in that program. Yes, the government has to go after that fraud in that program because those are tax dollars. But the difference between that, the PPP loans that were forgiven, and the Biden administration's unilateral action to try to forgive student loans, the key difference is Congress passed the PPP with the provision of those loans can be forgiven. Congress did not pass any kind of student loan debt transfer. Right? That's not something that Congress passed. Now, granted, there were about 1 million people in Illinois that were lined up to get that type of relief. Around 600,000 had been approved for that type of relief under the Biden proposal, but that's being shot down by the U.S. Supreme Court. And what's interesting here is Chief John Roberts, he really kind of highlighted how he sees a disturbing development in the dissent from the justices that are releasing their dissents in these cases. Here's something that John Roberts said in the Supreme Court's ruling on student loan debt. He said it's become a disturbing feature of some recent opinions to criticize the decisions for which they disagree as going beyond the proper role of the judiciary. He goes on to say, today we've concluded that an instrumentally created by Missouri, governed by Missouri and answerable to Missouri is indeed part of Missouri, and that words waived or modified do not mean completely rewrite, and that our precedent, old and new, requires that Congress speak clearly before a department secretary can unilaterally alter large sections of the American economy. We've employed that traditional tool of judicial decision-making in doing so. But Elena Kagan said that there was distorting standing doctrine, that the majority opinion was distorting standing doctrine to create a case fit for judicial resolution. The statute, read as written, gives the secretary broad authority to relieve a national emergency's effects on borrowers' ability to repay their student loans. But you've got, again, the back and forth. Roberts saying that Kagan's wrong and Congress has broadly authorized loan relief. The secretary and the president, unless that happens, can't just unilaterally make the decision to do so. So a lot of questions remain as to how some students' loan debt holders are going to be able to manage this moving forward, and in particular, what kind of economic consequences that's going to have moving forward. But there are other options out there, and President Joe Biden apparently is looking for different ways to try to implement some kind of student loan forgiveness. You do have the public loan, the public loan forgiveness program, the public student loan forgiveness, PSLF, I think it is, ultimately where if you work for a nonprofit for 10 years and you're making payments for those 10 years, then you can have the bulk of your loan forgiven. That's something that has been in effect for a while, not part of Biden's unilateral rule. So that's one option. And even the Illinois Student Assistance Commission is highlighting that as an option for people. Can that be expanded to others? Can that maybe, going from 10 years to 9 years to 8 years be implemented? Again, Congress has to act. It can't be done unilaterally. And I think that's the crux of that particular Supreme Court decision as well. So some pretty landmark Supreme Court decisions. Obviously, they're going to take a lot more cases in the future. Who knows? Maybe one of the cases they take up in a fall conference is going to have to be the challenge to Illinois' gun and magazine ban, and just how quickly they could act on that. Who knows? The courts move at their own pace, but obviously a lot of things that they have to consider in every court term, and we'll be watching it all.